The message for this morning has been brewing for a while, and I knew for a while that the person I was going to talk about, but not entirely sure which aspect of it. And suddenly, on a morning, it all came clear while I was outside running. And so this morning, I want to talk about a story that you probably all know and probably are very familiar with. And sometimes it's good to be reminded of certain things. Let us go to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 18. And we're going to dive in the story and at verse 25. If you want to read the whole context, you might want to start later on today in verse 1, but we're diving into in verse 25. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood." So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. And then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. And then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed. "For surely he's a god, perhaps he's daydreaming, or he's believing himself. Or maybe he's away on a trip, or he's asleep and needs to be wakened." So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. And then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded round him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel. And he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. And then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bowl into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. And then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour the water over the offering and the wood." And after they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And when they were finished, he said, "Now do it a 3rd time." So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar, and he even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord is God. Yes, the Lord is God." And then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all. And Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. You all know the story. It's very familiar. And you know what? It's an amazing story. It's an amazing miracle that happens here. But imagine being there and seeing this firsthand. I mean, how amazing would it have been to be there? We know the end. We know what happens. But the people that are there and witnessing this, they don't. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what Elijah is going to do. They see one man and they see 450 priests on the other side. And if you were there, and you might have been looking there with your natural eyes, and you think, "I know how this is going to end. There's one guy there, 450 there. I know quite soon how this is going to end. There's a minority on one side, a majority on the other side. I know which way this is going to go." But he didn't. And also the story doesn't stop there. Because after this amazing miracle, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and starts praying for rain. And you know what happens? It starts to rain. He could have been in England. We had plenty of it lately. And it's the next amazing miracle. Are you surprised of what happens? We could think one man against 450. A minority against a majority. We don't know how many other people were there. The Bible doesn't tell us. And how many were watching. It was a spectacle indeed. Did Elijah know for certain that God was going to show up? Is it not amazing that Elijah asked them to bring water as well? It's not enough that he just starts to build an altar, but then he asked them to just bring some water. And he said, just pour it over it. Not once, but 3 times. So the wood and the food, the bowl was soaked with water. And speaking of someone who was confident that God was doing something amazing, him against 450. Well, that's not entirely correct. It's one man plus God, and you know what? In God's word, that's always a majority. It always is. One man and God is a majority. They always win. It always happens. We can sometimes look around us and think we are not with many. What difference can we make? If you look at what's happening in the United Kingdom, in the political sphere, in everything what's going on, you could start to think we as Christianity, we as Christians are a minority now. And we can look at that and think, okay, but it's not always about numbers. It's about what God is doing. God didn't need Elijah, to be frankly honest. God doesn't need us. He's God. But God chooses to use us. He chose Elijah on this occasion. On the other ones, it was Moses. And then he chose David and Joshua. And he's choosing you and you and you and me to work for him. To be in relationship with him. God doesn't need the numbers. Nor do we. We need God to turn up and do something amazing like he did there. But let's see what else happens to Elijah. Elijah was on a spiritual high. I can imagine that. He had experienced an amazing miracle. He had experienced the fire from heaven coming and burning down this altar. And then they had chased all these priests and they're all gone. And then he had gone to the mountain, prayed for rain, and the rain was there. He was on a spiritual high. However, the story doesn't end there. Because we pick it back up at 1 Kings 19 verse 3 and 4. And it suddenly says this. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. And then he went on alone into the wilderness, travelling all day, and he sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. What is all this about? Elijah seems suddenly depressed, really down. He fears for his life. And he's afraid of Jezebel. And he runs away. Understandable? Yes. Think about it for a minute. Here is Elijah going into a spiritual battle, climbing Mount Carmel, and he hears that someone is going to kill him. And he runs away. Now, he doesn't run away just for a few minutes. He runs away 180 kilometers. That's how far he runs away. And result, Elijah is tired, exhausted. Sounds familiar?
Painful.
I hear a lot of people again saying, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and it's what's happening. I remember the times in Belgium when I went away for 3 to 4 weeks in one go on camps in the summer. I came back from a spiritual high, but I was exhausted. I was running on empty. It's very often when you run on empty that you are vulnerable for attack. And this attack can take on all sorts of different forms. Ross was reading some verses already about what God's made, what we can see and what we can't see, and everything what's happening in the spiritual realms. And I remember when the camps were finished, and I had to go in the car and drive home on an almost 2-hour car journey, trying to stay awake because just been on camps for 3-4 weeks, tired, exhausted. And what can happen inside your brain? The thought of going back to an empty house. I was used to live for 3-4 weeks with 120 people, and then suddenly you think, I'm going back home and there's nobody there, I'm on my own, and all of that stuff. And it messes with your brain. I started to feel down. You just experienced young people giving their lives to Jesus, great response time, great worship, and all that left behind for an empty house. And we see the same happening with Elijah here. A massive victory, the rain comes, and then suddenly someone threatens to kill you. And suddenly he starts to look at the circumstances. He starts to look about what's happening, and he hears this message: someone is going to kill you. Let's see what happens next, as I think that this is the point that it becomes interesting. We see that God does some amazing things here, because he looks after Elijah. And I've seen here 3 different ways that he looks after Elijah. But the first thing that we see that happens is Elijah sleeps. He rests. And suddenly he's woken up by an angel. An angel touched him and told him to get up and eat. What was in front of him? Freshly baked bread and water. He eats it, and what does he do then? He sleeps again.
Nice.
The angel woke him up again and told him to eat even more. And then the angel tells him, this will give you enough strength to travel for the next 40 days and 40 nights. I think, oh great, massive journey ahead of me. But how amazing is this? God looks after Elijah physically. He makes sure that he sleeps and that he eats. There is no conversation happening here. No telling off, like, Elijah, you have little faith. Have you not seen what I've done? Where's your faith gone? What have you done now? Have you not seen what I, Almighty God, have done for you? None of this is happening. God knows what Elijah needs. And this is not a pep talk at the moment. At the moment he needs rest, sleep and food. That's what he needs. And this is what God's provide for him. The rest, the sleep, the food, more sleep, more food.
Hydration.
And when you experience a spiritual high, you're very often tired after that. When you have been working full on for God, you become tired. So it's important that you take time to rest and look after yourself. That you eat the right food, that you look after your body. Once I noticed for myself what happens after the camps, I made some changes. I made sure that I never drove home on my own. That there was always someone with me in the car, not just to keep me awake, but also to talk together. We had a debrief in the car. We were reminiscing and thinking and talking and thanking God for what God's been doing during the camps. The other thing I did was make sure that we could eat something together once we were back home. We would very often meet up with some of the other leaders once we were back at our base, have some food together, regain some of our strengths. My pastors at the time knew how I was feeling because I told them. And they told me that I could always pop round to go and chat with them when I came home after the camps. So I did, several times. And you know what? The majority of times we were talking about just mundane things. And you know, it really helped. It's sometimes the little things that can make a massive difference. I think that for Elijah, just being fed by an angel and being woken up by an angel and being given some freshly baked bread and some water, I think it worked miracles for him. When you are tired and weary, you sometimes just need to have sleep and rest.
That's true.
So this is the first thing that Elijah does, that God does for Elijah. But what's next? What happens next is quite extraordinary. God tells Elijah to go on a journey, and he takes him to Mount Sinai or Horeb. Remember the mountain where God met with Moses? It's only a 40-day and 40-night journey. It's not that far, really. And once Elijah arrives, he spends the night in a cave, and then it starts. Can you believe what happens next? God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here?" "Hello God, have you forgotten? You asked me to come here. It was your angel that told me that the journey that was going on was going to be long and hard, and now you're asking me, well, what am I doing here?" Elijah is having a pity party. That's where he is at. He is still in the wrong mindset. He feels alone and forgotten, and on top they are trying to kill him. That's what is going on in Elijah's mind. I can imagine how Elijah was feeling. Do you recognize the feelings from when you're tired and down, and suddenly everything looks doom and gloom around you, and it all looks worse than it actually is? And a good night's sleep can do miracles for some of those feelings and everything else. But what does God do? He takes him to the mountaintop. It's very often on the mountaintop that you get the vision. It's so true. I love mountains. And to be honest, I don't go there enough. If it was just up to me, I would get there a lot more. I love climbing mountains. The climb is hard and tiring, but the reward is amazing. Once you get above the tree line, the view changes dramatically. You suddenly get this massive view, especially when you are at the top of the mountain. You get this 360 view. Well, at least that's when it's a clear day and the sun is shining, you get blue skies. But when a snowstorm is happening, this is what happened when I was on the top of Benevis. But I do remember when I was Mount Snowdon, and we had these beautiful blue skies and sunshine, and the view was absolutely stunning. It's then that you get the vision. It's very often in our spiritual life as well that God takes you to the mountain and to the mountaintop and gives you the vision. But you know what is also true? The growth happens in the valleys. And that's where it's tough sometimes, where the grafting happens. That's where we sometimes have to go through. But that's where the growth happens. On the top of the mountain, when you go to a real mountain, there's not an awful lot of growing. There's a lot to see, but there's not a lot of growth happening. It's very often deep down in the valleys that everything is growing and flourishing. So what happens on this mountaintop for Elijah? God looks after him spiritually. He speaks to Elijah. Remember what happened? He was first the wind, then the earthquake, then the fire, but God was in none of them. He was a gentle whisper that followed, and Elijah knew, it's now that I need to pay attention, because God is going to speak to me. Have you ever noticed that God shouts to his enemies but whispers to his friends? The Bible is full of examples like this. God looks after Elijah, his spiritual needs as well as his physical needs. Do we look after our spiritual needs? Do we allow God to look after our spiritual needs? Do we take time to listen to God, or are we too busy? Are we too occupied with our plans and desires? When was the last time you actually took time to listen to what God had to say? Do we take time for this? It is not surprising that this is happening to Elijah, as he had just been hearing from God. He played a major part in a significant miracle. But in a crucial way, he has become disconnected from God. It's got everything to do with the difference between our personal connection with God and our spending time serving Him. It's a little bit like in a marriage. You can spend the whole day with your spouse doing things without really connecting. There is one thing I've learned in full-time ministry. We can sometimes be so busy with doing things for God, for the church, that we forget to connect with the one we all do it for. And that's why sometimes we need to take time to do that. This is one of the reasons that I personally get up in the morning and go outside. To connect with God. That's one of the first things I do to start my day. And I know other people do this on a different way, but it's important to do this. I know that some people don't like silence. We get uncomfortable when it's quiet, and we need to do something to break the silence. However, there is something powerful about silence, because it gives you time to think, time to listen. It's very often in the silence that God starts to speak. Remember the verse, "Be still and know that I am God." We need to take time to pause and reflect and just stop. We need to take time to be thankful for what we have. Take time to pray and ask God for guidance and strength, and actually listen and say, "God, what do you have to say?" Does Elijah's circumstances change? No, they're exactly the same. They still want to kill him. So that hasn't changed. But what is happening? His perception starts to change. And that brings me to the last point. God looks after Elijah's emotional needs. When God speaks to Elijah, He asks Elijah something of what we could see as a strange question. He asks him again, "What are you doing here?" Have you ever wondered why God is asking him this question? What are you doing here? Did Elijah understand the question that God was asking? Did he see the significance of the place where he was? Elijah boldly declared that he was alone in 18 verse 22. Now this turns into the self-pity, and he feels really sorry for himself. "Oh, look at me, poor Elijah, I'm on my own, they're going to kill me." But what is God's response to his self-pity claim? God told Elijah to retrace his steps to the place where he strayed away from God's mission. But that's not the only thing that God does. He also corrected Elijah's thinking and reminded him that he wasn't alone. Earlier, Elijah had forgotten that Obadiah had protected 100 prophets. And now God is suddenly telling him that another 7,000 people are left. So he's definitely not on his own, is he? God could have told him this the first time round, but he didn't. Probably so that Elijah would only rely on God and not on the numbers of people left. We can sometimes be so caught up in circumstances that we don't see the bigger picture anymore. We feel sometimes sorry for ourselves and we don't see the reality anymore. Elijah could only see that he was alone. Yes, he was. Well, you can argue about this because God was there, God was with him. But God reminded Elijah that 7,000 people are left. So God is changing and addressing Elijah, his emotional needs. And he's helping Elijah to look at his circumstances from a different point of view. So what do? Do we allow our emotions to rule us? Emotions are important, but it's also important that they don't rule us. Do we allow God to challenge them now and then? Just like what he did with Elijah. Or when we feel down, do we just go deeper and deeper and deeper? Ultimately, this is not what keeps happening with Elijah. So this morning we have seen that God looks after Elijah when he just experienced some amazing things with God. He is tired. And what happens next is very human-like. He gets down and allows his emotions to get the upper hand. So what does God do? God looks after Elijah, his physical needs. He looks after his spiritual needs and his emotional needs. Is it not amazing that God Almighty, who created everything, looks after us like this? And is concerned about us like this? I don't know where you are this morning. Maybe you're sitting here and you're tired and weary. I am at the moment. And that's just because it's been non-stop. Maybe when you feel like that, maybe you just need to make a decision to rest, to sleep, and look after yourself a little bit more. Have some nice fresh bread. Or go out for a meal to the pub. Maybe you feel dry today. Maybe you're running around with only noise around you, and you never take time to listen to God. When was the last time you took time to listen to Him and allow Him to speak to you? Maybe you've been doing too much for God and have forgotten to connect with Him. Maybe you need to plan some time to do that. Maybe not tomorrow, but today. Maybe you're in a place where your emotions are all over the place, and maybe you need to let God look after your emotional needs and allow Him to do some heart surgery, as painful as that sometimes can be. Whatever your place you're in, God wants to meet you where your need is. Let me pray. Father, I do want to thank you that you are a God of miracles. That you are a God who still does miracles today.